brass plaque on the front door reads "Never trust a backdated signature," and the morning sun catches the engraved letters so they look almost gold. A quiet warning that every woman walking up the front step sees before she even knocks. This house, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a wraparound porch and copper gutters I hung myself, now operates as a rent-free transitional shelter for women fleeing domestic abuse. And last Tuesday, I watched a mother of 2 trace the letters with her fingertip and whisper, "Tell me the whole story." So I did. A year ago, that same door was barred against me with a deadbolt I didn't have a key for, and my stepfather was standing on the welcome mat with a forged will in his hand, telling me I had 48 hours to get out. The moment that flipped everything was when I found a wooden recipe box hidden behind a loose piece of tongue-and-groove pine in my mother's kitchen, a box with a note in her handwriting that said, "Do not trust Carl. Save yourself." This is the story of how that note led me to a forensic handwriting expert, a federal forgery investigation, and a judge's gavel that gave me not just a house, but a calling I never saw coming. I'm 55 years old, a retired commercial electrician, and 2 years ago I moved back into the house I grew up in after my mother, a widow of nearly a decade, told me she was remarrying. I had my own life, a cramped apartment near the industrial park, a job I just walked away from with a union pension, my 401k intact, and a set of knees that ached every time it rained from 3 decades of crawling through service cores and pulling cable. My mother was 78 and starting to forget the stove was on. I'd visit and find a pan of water boiled down to a scorched silver disc, or the back door left wide open overnight. She needed someone in the house, and the man she wanted to marry, Carl, had a friendly voice and soft, uncalloused hands that had never held anything heavier than a golf club. He seemed safe. He was a retired financial planner, if you can believe the irony, and he talked in a smooth baritone about consolidating accounts and maximizing the estate and making sure everyone was taken care of. Words that made me blink, but sounded responsible. He sat at our kitchen table with a notary, my mother beaming beside him, and he promised that if I moved in, if I poured my savings and my skill into renovating the place from the studs up, I would inherit my mother's half of the property. The house was worth about $390,000 at the time, free and clear in my mother's name. Carl said he'd put his half in a trust for me as well, a gesture of good faith. I believed him. I sold off $40,000 in stocks, emptied a $20,000 CD, and liquidated another $10,000 from my emergency fund, $70,000 total, and I bought lumber and copper pipe and Romex and 2-panel solid core doors. And for 18 months, I slept in a dusty back bedroom on a mattress I'd hauled from my apartment while I tore out plaster, rewired every circuit, sistered sagging floor joists, and rebuilt that house until it was the kind of home you'd see in a magazine. My mother passed on a Tuesday night in February, a massive hemorrhagic stroke that took her before the ambulance even cleared the driveway. I was the one holding her hand, and her fingers were still warm when I finally let go. Carl was at a weekly poker game he never missed, and when I called him, his voice did crack, and I thought it was grief. The funeral was on Saturday, a small service at the Methodist church with lilies my mother would have loved, and by Sunday morning the vultures had landed. Carl arrived at the house not alone, but with a woman I'd never seen before, a sleek blonde with a razor-sharp bob and a cashmere turtleneck the color of oatmeal, who he introduced as Lorna, an old friend helping him through the transition. Her heels clicked on the hardwood floors I'd sanded and sealed myself. They walked through the rooms as if they were appraising furniture, not mourning. Lorna picked up my mother's crystal candy dish, the one that had sat on the sideboard since I was a child, turned it over to check for a maker's mark, and set it down with a little disappointed click of her tongue that I can still hear. Carl opened the china cabinet and counted the plates aloud. I stood in the kitchen, still in the black dress I'd worn to the cemetery, the fabric stiff with dried sweat, watching them inventory my mother's life with the cold efficiency of an estate sale crew. That was when I noticed the paneling. The kitchen had a short knee wall between the counter and the dining nook, covered in tongue-and-groove pine that I'd stripped with chemical gel and refinished by hand, 7 layers of varnish sanded down to reveal a honey-blonde grain. One of the boards, the one just below the windowsill, was slightly proud of the others, maybe a 1/16 of an inch, and I'd seen it 100 times, and assumed it was my own sloppy carpentry from a Friday afternoon when my back hurt and I just wanted to be done. But now, in the strange hush of the house after the funeral, I noticed a tiny fingerprint smudge near the seam. A smudge that wasn't dust or construction grime, but something greasier, like the residue from a lotion my mother used to wear, lavender-scented and thick. While Carl and Lorna were upstairs arguing about whether to sell my mother's jewelry or keep it, for sentimental reasons that Lorna's tone made clear were entirely transactional, I pressed the edge of the board with my thumb. It popped free with a soft click, revealing a dusty cavity behind it that was just large enough to hold a small wooden box. The box was a recipe box, the kind with a little brass clasp and a hinged lid, the finish worn down to bare maple around the edges from decades of my mother's fingers flipping it open to find a card for oatmeal cookies or her famous lemon bars. I lifted it out, and the weight surprised me, heavier than old index cards should be. Carl came down the stairs just as I was sliding the board back into place, and he saw the box in my hands. His whole face tightened, the muscles around his eyes and mouth clamping down like a vise, and for a split second I saw not a grieving widower but something cold and calculating. "That's just old junk," he said, his voice pitched too high. "Toss it in the donation pile." He reached for it, but I held on, and Lorna appeared behind him with a cardboard box full of my mother's winter boots. "We're trying to streamline," she said, her smile thin as paper. "Less clutter, less stress. You'll feel so much lighter." I set the box on the counter, and Carl snatched it up, popped the lid, glanced inside with a dismissive flutter of his fingers, and then literally tossed it into a black trash bag he'd been using for broken picture frames and dried-up glue bottles. "Moldy recipe cards," he said. "You don't need that old stuff." They left an hour later with a promise to return in the morning to get the paperwork sorted, and as soon as their taillights cleared the driveway, I fished the box out of the trash. The bag reeked of acetone and old adhesive, but the box itself was clean and dry. And when I opened it, I found it packed tight with index cards in my mother's cursive, recipes for banana bread and chili, and the lemon bars she brought to every church potluck for 40 years. But at the very bottom, under a false bottom made of a cut-down greeting card with a faded picture of a kitten on it, was a single white envelope. It was sealed with a little circle of wax, the kind my mother used to use for special letters, embossed with a stylized rose from a stamp she kept in her desk. On the front, in my mother's unsteady but unmistakably deliberate script, was just my name, Catherine. I opened it carefully, the paper brittle, and inside was a note on the same heavy cream stationery she used for thank you cards, the kind with a watermark of a dove. The ink was a bit shaky, but every word was clear. It said, "Catherine, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Do not trust Carl. He has been moving money I never approved. I found a new will he typed up in my name. I sign nothing. I changed the trust 6 months ago, but he doesn't know. The house is not his. There is a key taped to the bottom of this box. It opens a safe deposit box at Pioneer Trust on Oak Street. Go there and talk to a woman named Margaret. She will explain the rest. Save yourself. Destroy this note. I love you. Mom." Taped to the underside of the recipe box, hidden under a strip of yellowed Scotch tape, was a small brass safe deposit box key with the number 712 stamped on the bow. I held it in my palm, and it felt like the weight of a promise my mother had made from beyond the grave. I read the note 3 times, then 4, then I burned it in the kitchen sink as instructed, holding the corner to the flame of a match and watching the words curl into ash that I washed down the garbage disposal. But the words were already seared into my brain. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people you renovate a life for should be the ones who actually show up when the dust settles. The morning after the funeral, Carl and Lorna returned with a manila envelope and a lawyer I'd never seen before, a guy with slicked back hair and a fountain pen that clicked too many times. He introduced himself as Alan Breckman, estate attorney, and he had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. They sat me down at the dining table, the same cherrywood table I'd sanded and restained with my own hands, and Carl slid a document across the polished surface like a dealer revealing a bad hand. It was titled Last Will and Testament of Martha Elaine Becker. I recognized my mother's signature at the bottom, a looped M and a trailing E that always looked a little shaky in her later years. But the date next to it was 3 weeks before she died, a time when she could barely hold a fork without spilling, and the contents of the will were a wrecking ball. It left everything, every piece of the house, every dollar of her savings, the entire $390,000 property to Carl, and upon his death to Lorna. I was not mentioned once, not even a token bequest. Erased. "You need to vacate," Carl said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Lorna and I are going to consolidate. It's what your mother would have wanted." Lorna reached across the table and patted my hand with her manicured fingers, and I noticed her nails, perfect ovals painted a soft pink, the kind of nails that had never snagged on a piece of Romex or caught on a splintered stud. "We'll help you pack," she said, her tone dripping with counterfeit sympathy. "This is a lot for you, sweetie. You've been through so much. We just want to take the burden off your shoulders." I looked at my mother's signature and remembered the note I'd burned the night before, the ashes I'd washed down the disposal, the words "do not trust Carl" still echoing in my skull. I did what any good electrician would do when faced with a live wire I couldn't identify. I played dead. "I don't understand," I said, letting my voice go soft and foggy, the voice of a woman who'd been sandbagged by grief and couldn't string two thoughts together. I thought I was going to live here. I fixed the wiring. I put in the new bathroom. I let my eyes go a little unfocused. Carl leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, and I saw the flicker of triumph in his expression. "See, she's not thinking clearly," he said to Lorna, loud enough for me to hear, as if I were a child or a piece of malfunctioning equipment. "This is exactly why we need to take over her finances. Catherine, sweetheart, you're 55, you've been under enormous stress. Why don't you come stay with us for a bit? We've got a guest suite with its own bathroom. You can rest and recover, and we'll handle all the paperwork." Power of attorney. That's what they wanted. I could see it in the way Lorna's eyes tracked to my purse, where my wallet and checkbook sat, and in the way the lawyer's pen suddenly stopped clicking. They wanted me to sign over complete control and then quietly disappear into some beige bedroom while they sold my mother's house and plundered every dime I'd saved. I nodded slowly, deliberately, like a woman who'd been hollowed out and didn't know which way was up. "Okay," I whispered. Maybe that's a good idea. I am so tired." I let a tear slide down my cheek, and it wasn't even entirely an act. Carl's smile didn't reach his eyes, but he thought he'd won. Over the next 3 days, while they helped me pack, I nodded through conversation after conversation about temporary guardianship forms and medical proxies and power of attorney boilerplate, and I absolutely did not sign a single one, no matter how many pens Alan Breckman clicked or how many times Lorna used the word "sweetheart." I just kept saying, "Let me rest first, I'm so foggy," and they bought it because they needed me to be weak. Then I packed a single suitcase with clothes, toiletries, and a small Ziploc bag containing the safe deposit box key and a burner phone I'd bought with cash at a gas station on the way over. I moved into the guest suite of Carl and Lorna's mid-century ranch house on the other side of town, a house I later learned had a second mortgage that was 3 months behind. The guest suite was a converted sun porch with rattan furniture and a lock on the outside of the door. I discovered that lock the very first night, when I pretended to be asleep and heard the soft click of a deadbolt sliding into place from the hallway side. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, the metallic chunk of a mechanism designed to keep something in. Control tactic, pure and simple. I lay in the dark, listening to their muffled voices through the wall, and I felt a cold, focused stillness settle over me. They thought they had caged a broken, confused woman who'd lost her mother and her savings and her will to fight. They didn't know I'd spent 30 years as a commercial electrician, pulling 12-hour shifts in hospital basements and high-rise service cores, that I could read a blueprint faster than most people could read a menu, that my toolbox was still in the trunk of my car with a full set of lockpicks from a summer I'd apprenticed with a locksmith, and that I was about to turn their own house into a surveillance post. For the first 2 weeks, I played the part to perfection. I shuffled around in a faded bathrobe. I let my hair go unwashed until it hung in lank gray ropes. I moved slowly and spoke in a whisper. Carl and Lorna relaxed so visibly I could almost hear the air go out of them. They started leaving doors open, having phone conversations within earshot, forgetting I existed as anything other than a piece of broken furniture. This is when the real investigation began. The first red flag came 3 days in. I was sitting on the back patio in a deck chair, hunched over with a throw blanket around my shoulders, pretending to doze. The sliding glass door was cracked open, and I could hear Carl pacing the kitchen linoleum, his voice a low, frantic hiss that he clearly thought I was too deafened by grief to catch. "I don't care about the penalty clause, just roll the whole thing over again." No, she hasn't signed anything yet, but she will. The house appraised at $410 last month, you know that. Once I get her signature on the quitclaim, the equity line pays off everything. Everything, you hear me? Just give me 30 more days. He slammed his phone down on the counter so hard I heard the rattle of silverware. A penalty clause, a rollover, an equity line. Those were not words from a man settling a simple estate. That was a man drowning in hawk-tup debt and using a house he did not own as a life raft, and I was the oar he intended to break. The second red flag came 4 days later when Lorna left her laptop open on the kitchen island, the screen tilted toward where I sat at the breakfast nook, pushing scrambled eggs around a plate. She'd been called away by a ringing phone in the other room, some tense conversation with a title company that I heard only in fragments, the words closing date and notarized signature leaking through the wall. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and angled my body so I could read the screen. The email inbox was open to a chain with a subject line that read, "Hellock application Becker property resubmission." I read quickly, my eyes moving over the text with the same speed I'd once used to scan electrical schematics. The emails detailed a pending home equity line of credit for $200,000, secured against my mother's house, with a condition precedent. A notarized quitclaim deed from one Catherine M. Becker, transferring all interest in the property to Carl L. Becker. The quitclaim deed was already drafted and attached as a PDF. The blank signature line had my name typed neatly underneath it. All they needed was my hand. Then, buried in the thread, I found a credit application for the same loan that listed my name as a co-applicant. My signature was already on the document, a clumsy, childlike scrawl that looked nothing like my actual signature, with a jagged loop on the C that slanted the wrong way. It was a forgery, brazen and sloppy, and it meant Carl was not just trying to steal my inheritance. He was setting me up as a co-signer on his debt, making me legally responsible for his $200,000 cash grab. If he defaulted, the bank would come after me. I'd lose the house and then drown in a ruin I never signed up for. I documented everything. I used my phone to photograph the laptop screen, each email, each attachment, then I set the phone down and went back to pushing my eggs around. I also started paying attention to the trash. Every recycling day, I volunteered to take the bins to the curb, and before I did, I rifled through the papers. I found credit card statements for 7 different cards, all maxed out, all in Carl's name, with interest rates above 25%. I found a past due notice from the country club, a second notice on the lease for the black luxury, SUV in the driveway, and a collection letter for an unpaid timeshare maintenance fee in Barbados. Carl and Lorna were spending money they did not have on a lifestyle that was entirely smoke, and the only solid asset in their orbit was my mother's brick-and-mortar house, free and clear, and the forged will that they believed would hand it to them. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning, and it started with a chicken bone. Lorna was jabbing a wooden spoon into the kitchen sink's garbage disposal, making helpless little grunts, while I sat at the table in my bathrobe with a cup of cooling tea. The sink had seized up the night before with a grinding sound I recognized instantly, a bone or a piece of metal jammed in the grinding ring. "The plumber wants $200 just to walk in the door," Lorna said to Carl, who was ignoring her from the living room. I let the silence hang for a moment, then I said, soft and hesitant, "I used to fix those. In the apartments I rented when the super was slow. I could take a look. It might just be stuck." Carl waved me off without looking up. "We're not doing amateur hour, Catherine." But Lorna was desperate, and I could see her calculating the $200 against whatever credit line she still had. "Let her try," she said. "What's the worst that could happen? It stays broken." So I fetched my toolbox from the trunk of my car, a heavy steel box with my name stenciled on the side in flaking white paint. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the floor with a thud that made Carl look up with a flicker of alarm. I knelt under the sink, my knees complaining on the tile, and I disconnected the disposal unit with the practice of 3 decades. I unclipped the housing, found the chicken bone wedged sideways in the grinding ring, pried it out with a pair of needle-nose pliers, and manually reset the internal flywheel with an Allen wrench from my kit. I reconnected the unit, tightened the clamps, and flipped the switch. The disposal roared to life, smooth and hungry. I stood up, wiped my hands on a rag, and looked at Lorna. She was staring at me like she'd never seen a woman with calluses before. Carl was in the doorway, a strange, pinched expression on his face that I recognized as wariness with a spike of fear. That was the first crack in my foggy old lady disguise, but I covered it with a sweet, lost smile. "Muscle memory, I guess," I said, letting my voice trail off. I don't even remember doing it. They bought it because they had to, because the alternative was that the broken woman they'd locked in the sun porch was a retired electrician with a toolbox full of potential weapons, and that thought was too terrifying to entertain. But now I had my toolbox in the house, and in that toolbox, in a small leather roll inside the top tray, was a set of slender lockpicks I'd kept from a summer apprenticeship in 1988 when I worked for a locksmith just to make rent. The next day, while Carl and Lorna were out at a title company appointment they did not think I knew about, I'd seen the reminder pop up on Lorna's phone when she'd left it on the coffee table. I made my move. Carl's home office was at the end of the hallway, a room with a cheap privacy lock on the door, the kind that you can pop open with a butter knife or a firm credit card. I wasn't taking chances, though. I used a tension wrench and a rake pick from my leather roll, sliding them into the keyway with the quiet precision that came back to me like riding a bike. The lock gave way with a soft click after about 20 seconds, and I eased the door open, my heart hammering but my hands steady. Inside, I found a filing cabinet next to a cluttered desk. The cabinet had a heavy-duty lock, a 4-pin tumbler that took me maybe 90 seconds of careful raking and tension adjustment to finesse, the familiar sheer line clicking over with a satisfaction that felt almost sacred. The top drawer was packed with folders that reeked of desperation, bank statements with red ink overdrafts, tax returns that showed a plummeting income, and a thick accordion file labeled estate planning in Carl's blocky handwriting. Inside that file, I found the smoking guns. First, a draft copy of the same will Carl had shown me at the dining table, but this one was covered in correction marks from a word processor, and taped to the corner was a sticky note in Carl's handwriting that read, "Date back to before stroke, sign with left hand." Left hand. My mother was right-handed. The signature he'd ultimately produced was shakier than her normal script, not because she was old or sick, but because he'd either made her sign with her non-dominant hand to mimic post-stroke weakness, or, more likely, he'd traced her signature himself from an old document, hesitating at every curve. Second, I found the original credit application with my forged signature, and clipped to it was a note from a loan officer that said, "Co-applicant signature appears inconsistent with baseline. Please provide notarized verification." Carl had tried to push this through once and been flagged, which is why he now needed my live, notarized signature on the quitclaim to circumvent the verification. He was getting desperate and sloppy. The third thing I found made me stop breathing. It was a document titled Irrevocable Trust Declaration for the Martha Becker residence, dated 6 months before my mother's death. It was a notarized copy, filed with the county recorder, and it stated that the house had been transferred into a revocable living trust with my mother as trustee and me as the sole beneficiary, with a unique provision. Any sale, transfer, or encumbrance of the property required the notarized signature of Catherine M. Becker, the beneficiary, in the physical presence of 2 witnesses, one of whom had to be a representative of the trust's designated fiduciary, a bank named Pioneer Trust. Even if I were dead, the trust contained a poison pill clause that stated if I died under suspicious circumstances or was declared incapacitated, the entire estate reverted immediately and irrevocably to a domestic violence shelter charity called Safe Harbor. My mother had built a legal trap so tight it could catch a rat by the ankle. She had seen Carl moving money, found his fake will draft, and instead of confronting a man she was too sick and scared to leave, she went to a real estate attorney and locked the house up inside a trust that Carl could not touch unless I stood beside him, alive, willing, and witnessed by a bank officer. He could kill me, and he'd still never get a dime. I photographed every page with my burner phone, replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, relocked the filing cabinet, relocked the office door, and retreated to my sun porch with my heart pounding like a steam hammer. That night, after the outside lock clicked, I sat in the dark and made a series of phone calls from the burner. The first was to Pioneer Trust, where I asked for Margaret by name, as my mother's note had instructed. A calm, measured female voice answered, and I told her who I was and what I'd found. There was a long pause, then she said, "Your mother was a very wise woman. The trust is active and untouchable. We have a dormant fraud investigation unit that liaises with the FBI on elder abuse cases. I think you need to speak to our federal contact. Hold the line." Moments later, a man's voice came on, low and professional. He introduced himself as Agent Mike Callahan. I told him everything, my voice barely a whisper, and he listened without interrupting. When I was done, he said, "We've been looking at Carl Becker for 18 months. He's part of a pattern. Do not sign anything, do not tip your hand, and if you can get me a copy of that sticky note and the forged credit application, we can move on him within a week. Can you get to a copy shop?" I told him I could if I manufactured a reason, and we made a plan. 2 days later, during another carefully scheduled doctor's appointment for a follow-up on my supposed grief-induced anxiety, Carl drove me to a medical plaza and dropped me at the curb. I waited until his SUV pulled away. Then I walked through the building, out the back service entrance, and into a public library 4 blocks away where Agent Callahan had arranged to meet me. He was a tall man in a gray suit with a quiet, unhurried manner. I handed over a USB drive with all the photos, plus the original safe deposit box key. He told me that my mother's safe deposit box at Pioneer Trust contained additional documentation she'd filed with the bank, including a handwritten affidavit describing Carl's attempted fraud, and a short video statement recorded on a DVD that the bank compliance officer would play for me later. My mother, a woman who could barely work a remote control, had walked into a bank and recorded a deposition for a crime that hadn't even fully occurred because she knew it was coming. I sat in that library cubicle and let myself cry for exactly 60 seconds. Then I pulled it together and asked Callahan what I needed to do next. He gave me a small recording device, a digital audio recorder disguised as a USB charger, and told me to carry it with me at all times. "Document everything," he said. "The moment he tries to coerce a signature from you, especially if he threatens you or uses force, we have him." I tucked the device into the lining of my purse and returned to the medical plaza, where Carl was already waiting, tapping his steering wheel and grousing about the wait time. The maximum cruelty beat happened 4 days later, on a Sunday morning, and it is the moment that erased any residual guilt I'd ever feel about sending my stepfather to prison. I was sitting on my bed in the sun porch, and I could hear Carl and Lorna in the living room, their voices sharp and panicky. They were arguing about a credit card that had been declined at a gas station. Lorna was hissing something about her signing that paper or we're sunk, and Carl was saying, "I'll get it today, just shut up." I decided to test them. I waited until the house fell quiet, then I walked into the hallway, clutched my chest with both hands, let out a soft, breathless gasp, and crumpled to the floor. I felt exactly like a person having a cardiac event, my full weight dropping onto the hardwood with a thud, my eyes fluttering closed, my body going limp. I held my breath and listened. Lorna's voice came first, sharp and annoyed. "Oh my God, is she?" Then Carl, cutting her off with a tone that was pure ice. "Don't touch her. Where's the folder? The quitclaim deed. She hasn't signed it yet." I heard his footsteps, not toward me, but away into his office. Drawers opening, papers rustling. Then I felt the vibration of his footsteps returning. A toe nudged my shoulder, not gently, but with the prod of someone checking if a piece of trash was still stuck to the floor. Carl's voice floated down from above me, flat and clinical. Catherine, can you hear me? If you can hear me, squeeze my hand." He grabbed my wrist not to check for a pulse, but to press my limp fingers against a piece of paper that he'd placed on the floor right next to my head. I could feel the edge of a document, the cool slickness of a signature line. He was trying to guide my hand into a forgery, a live signature from a woman he thought was dying at his feet. I let my hand go even limper. The pen he'd threaded between my fingers clattered to the floor. I moaned, a weak little sound, and whispered, "Hurts, chest." Carl sighed, a heavy exhalation of pure, undiluted annoyance, and straightened up. I heard his shoes scuff the floor as he stepped back. "She's useless," he said to Lorna, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he'd discovered a broken appliance. "We'll try again when she's more lucid. Call 911 in 10 minutes. Let her suffer a bit, it makes them easier to control. I've seen it with my own mother." The words took a second to land, and when they did, I felt a coldness wash over me that had nothing to do with the floor. He stepped over my body, Lorna following, their footsteps retreating down the hall, and the last sound I heard was Lorna's quiet, nervous laugh. I lay there on the cold hardwood, my cheek pressed to the floor I'd polished to a high shine, and I felt the final, fraying thread of family loyalty that I'd been hoarding in my chest snap and dissolve. I had no father left, no stepbrother, just the memory of a woman who'd written me a note and built a legal fortress, and the quiet, righteous fury of a working-class electrician who had spent her life fixing things. When the paramedics arrived 8 minutes later, Lorna must have called a little early out of nerves. I let them check me over, and I played the confused old woman with a panic attack so convincingly that one of the EMTs patted my hand and said, "You take it easy, ma'am." Carl stood in the doorway, a doting stepfather mask back in place, wringing his soft hands. Once they were gone, I retreated to my sun porch, retrieved the digital recorder from my purse, it had captured every word, and called Agent Callahan. "I got it," I said. "Attempted coercion, forgery in progress, and a direct admission. I'm ready." The next morning, Carl burst into my room with a notary public in tow, a nervous little man with a stamp that he kept clicking in and out of his pocket. "Catherine, we're going for a drive," Carl announced, his smile tight and plastic. "We need to sign some final estate papers at the title company. Just a formality, then you can rest." I played groggy but compliant, let them help me into the back seat of their SUV, and we drove not to a bank but to a strip mall title company storefront with faded gold lettering and a dusty potted plant by the door. Inside, a small conference table was set with a single document, the quitclaim deed transferring my interest in the house to Carl, and a durable power of attorney giving him control over all my assets. Lorna was already there, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, a sheen of sweat on her upper lip despite the air conditioning. Carl guided me into a chair and slid a heavy pen across the table. "Sign here, sweetheart, on both lines. Then we can all go home and put this behind us." I looked at the pen, a big silver rollerball that felt cold when I picked it up. I looked at Carl, whose smile was now just a grimace. I looked at Lorna, who was practically vibrating. Then I sat up straighter in the chair, let my shoulders square, and I let the fog drain from my eyes. I spoke in a voice that was not weak or confused or broken, the same voice I'd used 30 years ago on job sites full of men who told me a woman couldn't carry a bundle of 3-inch rigid conduit. "I know about the forged will, Carl. I know about the home equity line of credit. I know you've been tracing my mother's signature and forging mine on loan applications. I know about the trust, the poison pill, and the safe deposit box my mother left me. And I know you just stepped over my dying body to grab a pen. You're done." The color drained from his face so fast I thought his knees might buckle. Lorna sucked in a sharp breath and looked toward the door, but Carl recovered like the cornered animal he was. He lunged across the table and grabbed my wrist again, his grip of ice, and tried to force my hand to the signature line. "You'll sign," he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath sour with coffee. "You'll sign or you'll regret it." That was the moment the front door of the title company opened and Agent Callahan walked in, followed by 2 county sheriff's deputies, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Callahan was holding a folder that contained my mother's trust documents, the forensic handwriting report from Dr. Ellen Vance that I hadn't even gotten around to telling Carl about, the falsified credit applications, and a transcript of every word the USB charger had recorded. "Carl Becker," Callahan said, his voice calm and carrying the weight of federal authority. "You're under arrest for felony forgery, wire fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft by deception. Lorna Chatfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud." Lorna shrieked and made a break for the back door, but a deputy caught her by the arm with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Carl stood frozen, his hand still locked on my wrist, and I pried his fingers off one by one, bending them back just enough to make him wince. "You should have just asked me for help, Carl," I said, and my voice was steady as a level line. "I would have loaned you money, I would have helped you dig out, but you tried to steal my mother's house and bury me in debt. That was your mistake, and now you get to learn what a real consequence feels like." The legal aftermath was so thorough it still feels like a dream sequence when I describe it. Dr. Ellen Vance, the forensic document examiner I'd met covertly, produced a report that was 64 pages of pure devastation for the defense. She analyzed a dozen baseline handwriting samples from my mother's personal correspondence, cards, and old checkbooks, and she compared them to the signature on the forged will. Using a combination of microscopic line analysis, infrared spectrometry to identify ink composition, and pressure mapping techniques, she proved beyond any reasonable doubt that the signature was a traced forgery. The ink on the will, she discovered, was from a pen manufactured in a batch that wasn't released until 4 weeks after the date on the document. The tremor patterns, as she testified in her deposition, were not the smooth, rhythmic wobble of a genuine age-related or post-stroke tremor. They were the jagged, stop-and-start hesitation marks of a person tracing a signature line, pausing at curves to recalculate the stroke. She also demonstrated that the signature showed uniform pressure throughout, which is physically impossible for a right-handed signer who naturally exerts more pressure on downstrokes. It was a masterpiece of forensic analysis, and the prosecutor told me later it was one of the most airtight expert reports he'd ever seen. Carl, faced with the mountain of evidence and the audio recording of his own voice saying, "Let her suffer a bit," pled guilty before the criminal case could even go to trial. He copped to 3 counts of forgery and 1 count of financial elder abuse. Lorna pled to conspiracy to commit fraud. Both were sentenced to 4 to 7 years in state prison, and the judge, a gray-haired woman with a no-nonsense stare, ordered full restitution. Every asset they owned, the mid-century ranch, the SUV, the country club membership, the timeshare, everything was liquidated to repay the creditors they'd defrauded, including the banks they'd lied to. My mother's house was declared mine by virtue of the trust, free and clear, and the forged quitclaim deed was voided with a single stroke of the judge's pen. The civil case was even more brutal for them, and I did not pull a single punch. I sued for wrongful eviction, conversion of my renovation investment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, with the recording of my faked heart attack as the centerpiece of the emotional distress claim. The judge heard the audio in open court, watched Carl's color drain a second time, and awarded me a judgment of $240,000 against Carl and Lorna personally, the precise sum of my $70,000 renovation outlay, my legal fees, and punitive damages for trying to forge a signature from a woman he believed to be dying. They couldn't pay it right away, of course. Their money was gone like smoke, but the judgment hangs over them with a 20-year renewal clause, and every dime they ever earn in prison or after will have my name on it. I don't need the money. I just wanted the principal, and the principal is a stone around their necks. A month after the sentencing, I sat in the kitchen of my mother's house, the same kitchen where I'd found the recipe box, and I opened a thick envelope from Pioneer Trust that had been hand-delivered by Margaret, the compliance officer. Inside was a letter my mother had filed with the trust, a letter Margaret had been instructed to give me only once the house was legally mine, and the threat was neutralized. It was written on the same heavy stationery, and her handwriting was a little stronger in this one, as if she'd written it before her final decline. It read, "Catherine, if you're reading this, you found the box and you figured it out. I am so proud of you, my steady girl. I knew Carl was a liar and a thief, but I was too old and too scared to leave him, so I did the only other thing I could do. I built a wall. You were always the one who fixed what the world broke. Now fix this house for someone who needs it. There's a nonprofit called Safe Harbor I've been donating to. They need space. Think about it. Love you forever, Mom." I didn't just fix the house, I transformed it. The day the deed came back with only my name on it, I called a lawyer and set up a 501(c)(3) nonprofit. 6 weeks later, I had a license from the county to operate a transitional shelter. The house I'd renovated with my own 2 hands. The 3 bedrooms with the solid core doors I'd hung. The wide kitchen with the copper sink I'd installed. The porch I'd resanded. All of it became a landing place for women who were running from the men who'd promised to protect them. Women fleeing domestic abuse can stay there rent-free for up to 6 months. And my team, a retired social worker and a part-time legal aid volunteer, helps them get protection orders, job training, counseling, whatever they need to stand on their own and never have to crawl back. On the front door, I installed a brass plaque. It isn't flashy, 8 inches by 4, engraved with a simple serif font and mounted at eye level. It says, "Never trust a backdated signature." Every woman who walks through that door touches it, some with trembling fingers, some with an angry slap, some with a long, slow caress like they're greeting an old friend. I tell them the story, not to glorify my own pain, but to show them that the system, for all its flaws, can work if you document everything, if you keep your head when the vultures are circling, and if a 55-year-old electrician with a toolbox and a mother's love is standing on the other side of the door. My mother was a quiet woman who baked lemon bars and sang off-key to the radio, but in the end, she outsmarted a career predator with a single handwritten note, a recipe box, and a trust agreement that was tighter than a sealed conduit. And me, I just finished the job she started, using a skill set I learned in crawl spaces and attics and on steel-toed feet, a skill set no one in my so-called family ever respected until the day it dismantled them. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments below. And if you believe that real family is the people who show up with calloused hands and open hearts, not the ones who show up with a forged signature and a hidden pen, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel for more stories of betrayal, resilience, and the kind of justice that comes from knowing exactly how locks work. I'll see you in the next one.